Having my backs to you, so I don't want to be in the camera, so. Okay. I'd like to welcome everyone. We're going to get started in a minute here. My name is Maurice Stakina. I organized this workshop for Columbia University. This oral history workshop happens every other Tuesday and evening here in this room or another space on campus. And tonight we're really honored to have Dr. Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani and Ruth Sergel here to talk about their work and the intersections between their work. Both Ruth and Gabrielle are change agents, I think we can safely say after our conversation. Their work deals with place and identity and creating spaces where wisdom, I believe, can arise and people can work together collaboratively. I'm going to just give you a little bit of background on both of our speakers tonight. Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani is an urbanist photographer and curator, professor of urban studies at the New School, and co-founder of the interdisciplinary practice on place and dialogue, Buscada, through which she creates projects that engender dialogue between communities, individuals, and disciplines to explore critical questions of place and visual urbanism. She holds a doctorate in environmental psychology from the Graduate Center at CUNY and is a visiting fellow at the Center for Urban and Community Research, Goldsmiths, University of London. She has worked on projects internationally and has exhibited at places such as Creative Time, the Center for Architecture, over at Parsons, MIT, UC Berkeley, and the Abrams Art Center. And her work has been reviewed in many prestigious journals. And she also is the co-founder of the Urban Encounters Conference on visual urbanism held at the Tate. And Ruth we'll welcome her back. She spoke to our fieldwork class this fall. Makes big projects that harness technical prowess for community engagement and social transformation. Thank you, Ruth. You kindly provided me with that. She has created Chalk, an annual community commemoration of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which began in 2005. Her Voices of 9/11 project, many of you know here, where over 550 video testimonies in New York, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and inside the Pentagon people talked about their experiences with 9/11. It's also been exhibited at the Corcoran. Her award-winning films have been screened at the MoMA, on PBS, and at the IFC here. Ruth's interactive documentaries have been exhibited in the U.S. and Europe, and a Magic Box was created with the support of the Experimental Television Center, which that's one of my favorite projects, and Alchemy of Light is equally beautiful. Ruth has a wonderful website, and you can see many of her projects there. She was a visiting fellow in public humanities at Brown University, and has presented her work at the National Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. Her work has been covered extensively in the New York Times, CNN, National Public Radio, and she was an honored guest at the White House, and Ruth's work was featured in CNN this weekend. So Gabrielle. I'm looking at you, Gabrielle, and your work intersects in so many ways, and you worked on the Triangle Fire Project, so I hope we can talk a little bit about that, but please join me in welcoming Ruth and Gabrielle.
Thank you for having us. We're both, I think, very excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation. So I thought what we would do, start off, and what I'd like to do is to present two projects to you guys around this kind of idea of thinking about public projects as ways of making space for dialogue. And these two projects are projects that I've been working on for a significant number of years. This one in particular has been a 4-year project. And they're looking at two different sites where something happened quite a while ago at this point. So the first one is the Seward Park Urban Renewal Area, and that's this project called the Billiards Borough project. The second site, that's what it looks like now. And my second site is the Ash Building in Greenwich Village in New York, talking about the Triangle Fire Open Museum. Just to give you a little background on what these two sites are, to give you a little history about kind of where we are. Stewart Park Urban Renewal area is on the Lower East Side. If any of you are familiar with the Williamsburg Bridge, you have gone past this site. Mostly it's a lot of parking lots right now. And it was a 14 square block area that was slated for urban renewal and demolition in 1967. And almost 2,000 families were displaced from this area. This was what it looked like. This is actually from the promotional literature that was the plan for the urban renewal. So you can see that they were highlighting, look, we'll get rid of these terrible tenements, which now rent for $6,000 a month, 2 blocks away. But we'll get rid of these and we're going to build something much better. But what actually happened was nothing got built. And so that's a part of this history. Many of the people who were displaced were families of color, most of them low income, and what was promised and what was planned was for it to be a moderate and low income housing development. The context is that more than 40 years later, very little new has actually been built on this site. So there have been a few buildings that have been built since and the demolition actually took close to 15 years. So people lived with the kind of displacement and then the scar of watching their neighborhood deteriorate over 15 years. So that's the context for this site. And then, of course, you guys, so this is sort of what it looks like if you're looking at it sort of romantically through the chain link fence with the morning glories. But you can see the parking lots and the very few buildings that were actually built. So this is a very different site. It's the site of the Triangle Fire, right? We can think about the site as another kind of very important and significant sort of piece of New York City history happened. So 1911 we're talking about now, and we're talking about the context of labor history, labor activism, the kind of organizing that was happening around the time of the fire, the kind of labor conditions that were in existence at the time. So a very, very different kind of context, but a very similarly interconnected kind of event, so connected to much larger questions. If Borough is connected to larger histories of race in this country, of larger questions of housing and inequity, the Triangle Fire is really connected to much larger questions about labor rights, women's rights, immigrants' rights, right? So that we can sort of see these two sites and these two projects as being very, very specific, but also very sites of really two tragedies in New York history, but also with very complex histories that have very many larger issues that are embedded within the specifics of their histories. And that's kind of why I wanted to talk about the two of them together today, and why the projects that I want to present really focus on looking at these narratives as a way of telling through making space for dialogue to talk through the complexity of these past histories. And one of the things that I'm really always extremely cognizant of is the idea that many, many diverse communities are affected by both of these sites and both of these histories. And most often these are very divergent communities who are impacted by these two sites and these two histories, with very divergent interests and very divergent needs. And in this kind of practice, in this kind of work that is thinking about how do we not only imagine kind of the different roles of who's involved in the site and understanding its history, but also how do we think about public projects and how do we bring multiple communities back together. It's this idea of making a space for dialogue. I think we have to be very cognizant of defining what community is. And one of the things that I've found is that too often, I would say, in engaged or collaborative projects, the idea of community is taken too simply or too positively. And it really makes me heed, all of this work really makes me heed Raymond Williams' warning, which I think is really quite excellent, that community can be the warmly persuasive word to describe an existing set of relationships, or to describe an alternative set of relationships. But what's most important, perhaps, is that unlike all other terms of social organization, state, nation, society, all of those words, it seems to never be used unfavorably. I think we can really look to think about this idea of taking apart what community means, and I think that's a big part of the kind of practice that I think both Ruth and myself are engaged in, and sort of looking critically at it. So just to let's kind of jump in to introduce that first project. So why talk about these projects together? Really because of this idea of the complexity of these kinds of community that are embedded in these two sites and these two really complex histories with divergent points of view and divergent ideas of claims made to them. So the first one, the Billiards Borough project. So this is what the map of that area looks like now. You can remember that all those tenements were in that picture. Well, you can't really see it at all, actually. I can see it perfectly. Maybe can we? Well, there it is. So, south of Delancey, down to Grand, east from Essex over to Pitt Street. What was 14 square blocks of tenements? So this is what it looks like now. You can see how very few buildings are actually on that site. And this idea, what Marie sort of mentioned in my bio in terms of talking about this idea of a practice of visual urbanism, is what I'm really interested in using to unpack some of these really complex ideas and these complex sites. So this parcel of land is not only the site of this really complex history, and some would really explain it as a tragedy of displacement in the late 60s, but it's also located at this very potent kind of intersection and parcel of land at the Lower East Side, right? So it's a kind of the intersection of the historically Jewish, Chinese, and Puerto Rican Lower East Sides, and it really has a very important kind of connection for all of those communities. And so when my students take their first walk through Borough, they always have this kind of shock of bewilderment and also of recognition. Though it's a very complicated and hard to understand place. Visually, it's hard to make sense of it, but it's also a place that you've all sort of been to before and maybe turned away from and sort of walked around. And so I began this project in 2008 through a class I teach at the New School called City Studio. And I developed the class as a way to look at this site and to understand its context now and to understand the nuances of its history, and to use a kind of hybrid approach of pedagogy and activism, kind of art and research, and to train students to sort of see this space in a new way, and to use it as a way to bring a complex kind of collaboration between students and community organizations. And my students really engage in practices that lead us to make things that look like this. So how do we kind of use this history and engage with this history, and why make something that ends up being an exhibition to ask some kinds of complex questions about these important and kind of contradictory histories that are embedded there. So part of what we do is to really engage with the complexity of what this idea of community is. And so, at some point when I work with students, there's always a point in which they have struggled they've learned this history, they've read oral histories, they've started to talk with people in community meetings, at community visioning sessions, they've read a whole history of housing and inequity in New York City, and they at some point think, there is really nothing we can do here. And they throw up their hands to a certain extent because they wonder how they can bring some sort of new perspective to this community struggle, and also how do they engage with a site that's not their own. And so that's something that through this process has been really important to think about kind of grounding ourselves in site's history. So using ways of engaging with really deep kind of community participation, taking part in and being useful to community visioning sessions that have happened over the last 4 years, having long-term partnerships with community organizations such as Goals, good old Lower East Side, coalition activists like Choose for Racial and Economic Justice. So sort of building a broad base of collaboration and kind of understanding through the community. So that's been a really important part. And this idea that through these kinds of long-term practices, because I've been working on this project for 4 years, that we build trust over that period of time. And I think we've really also sort of developed ideas both sort of within the class and as a practice, and also in collaboration with our community partners about what art practices, whatever that might mean, can do in this context of community activism. And that's, I think, been a really interesting and important part of the project. So we spend a lot of time brainstorming. We think about, well, what in fact are the goals of doing this kind of work? You know, how do you actually include voices? How do you think about the possibilities? How do you kind of make something that is open rather than closed? My students go through processes. These are mostly students who are not art students or not design students, so they often, the idea of making form from rich kinds of in-depth research is very alien to them. So the practice of building in what is a critique and how do you kind of make things. Ruth and I were just talking earlier with students, and one of the things that we were talking about was, you know, how do you get things funded? Well, one of the ways I think we get things funded is by actually making things and showing a project. And so this is also part of this, is like this idea of processes of making. So we have lots of critiques, lots of trying things out, and lots of ways of sort of thinking through how do you make visual these very complex questions about a site that is highly contested and highly divided. So thinking about making maps. So this has led to a series of exhibitions. So in local areas, so in the local area neighborhood community centers. So this one was at Common Room, a small gallery space. This one was also there. And you can see these projects that are extraordinarily kind of interactive, that try to look at qualities of this space. So one of the goals of this work has not been to suggest what should happen on this site, which is these kind of open parking lots that are, this is also the, I should say, the largest city-owned plot of land in New York, south of 96th Street. It's an incredibly valuable portion of land, and it is very large. And so there are many people who have a lot of very divergent ideas about what should happen here. And one of the goals of this project has always been not to say what should happen here, but how to open up the conversation to ask questions about what could happen here, as a way of suggesting that the multiple communities involved could actually sort of use these spaces of these exhibitions to talk with each other. This is at the Abrams Art Center. One of the things that has been exciting and sort of surprising has been that many of our community partners they're always there at these openings, and they have said, you know, I've never actually seen this group of people in this room together not screaming at each other. So it's also been about the ways in which a practice that has been very engaged and sort of nuanced and trying to get in depth to the history, the kind of pulling out of people's stories, how can we present that back to the community in a way that people can sort of think about the actual specifics of the site rather than kind of their own kind of ideological position or what they're kind of coming into it with. So this is Abrams Art Center, people kind of looking at this project that was called Framingsboro, which students really tried to show the different ways and the different kind of imaginations that have been made for this space, to show kind of how very, very different and how very many kinds of imagined futures there have been, and divergent imagined futures there have been for this site. We took part in the Creative Time Living as Form exhibition, and really sort of used it as an opportunity. We had a little booth, and used it as an opportunity to talk with people. This is actually at the edge of that site, when we ended up talking with many people who had no idea of this history. And so another way that this form of this project has actually happened is not just through the exhibitions, but thinking about other ways of making space for dialogue. So I created a series of walking tours as well. So participants in these walking tours are given one of these layered Spura cards, and for each card it has an image and a quote about some aspect of the history of Spura. It's almost like they're sort of cue cards for its history. And so as I lead people through this space, there's me in October, I'll kind of, at intervals, I call on people to read their cards aloud. So it's also about kind of thinking about the ways in which the voices of these histories can be brought back into this physical space itself. And so there on the street, we kind of take turns embodying these really conflicting voices of Spura's past and present. So as the group leans in, so one young woman brings us the voice of an elderly man, long ago pushed out of Spura, an older man on the tour, so this is kind of displacement, an older man on the tour reads the voice of a woman who fears what affordable housing, quote unquote, will do to her newly purchased co-op's property values. A student at the local high school reads from the 1973 court transcripts of the racial discrimination class action lawsuits that were brought against the two public housing buildings that were actually built on the site when they opened. So this portion of the project is not just kind of creating spaces for dialogue through exhibition sites, but also kind of amongst one specific small group kind of in the practice of walking. And sort of inserting that into a space where, in that kind of physical space where these kinds of conversations have been really sorely lacking. So this is what happened this year, was a culmination of 4 years of this practice. This was, and this was the first time that this work was actually shown outside of the community. This was at the New School. And so one of the things that was quite interesting to me was to think about, well, how can this be another sort of space? And so, you know, who are the audiences and who are the communities that are kind of coming to this space as opposed to these other spaces as well? You can see different people looking at it. And, you know, one of the things that happened at the opening was someone asked me what the eventual goal of this project was. And I realized that really quite simply, and I think my answer sort of surprised her, I said, well, actually that it's really simply having people together in this room talking about this question. And that answers to what should happen in this kind of contested site really have to come from within the community, but that without a space for having a dialogue around that, there's really no way to get to that point. So this is one of the comments left at the exhibition. And so I just want to kind of shift gears a little and to show you a small portion of the Triangle Fire Open Archive and Open Museum project to kind of show a different way of taking this approach. And so here we are back at the Ash Building. You know, we're jumping back in time to 1911. It feels like a very divergent kind of question, you know, thinking about the history of this fire that was so incredibly destructive to the people who were inside this building, but actually not to the building itself. You know, and thinking about, you know, why is this still relevant? Well, you know, 2010, we have a similar kind of fire happening in Bangladesh. We have questions about labor organizing. We have questions about, you know, Scott Walker banning unions, all of this kind of thing that's happening right now. So how do we sort of think about the larger questions embedded in both of these sites as a reason for investigating them and as a reason for instigating kinds of dialogue around them? So, you know, thinking about, well, this is what the Triangle Fire Open Archive looks like. So how can a form that looks like this, a virtual online space, really address some of those sorts of questions? So the project really takes this very participatory and collaborative approach. It's a collaboration between the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, which Ruth will certainly talk about. Ruth is the founder of that coalition, and Buscada, my organization. And so one of the things that was so phenomenal, and as we sort of think about kind of definitions of community, was to think about, well, who was involved in this coalition and how incredibly broad and amazing those conversations were that happened between these groups of people. And so one of the things that we really wanted to do was to take an approach that sort of harnessed some aspect of the fact that all of these people were getting together in a room around thinking about the Triangle Fire Centennial. And to think about, well, can objects tell stories? Can those objects stand in for these multiple perspectives that were sort of being brought into the room? And so we created this open archive, which is an online space of community contributed objects, that we asked people to just contribute objects that they thought for some reason told some portion of the Triangle Fire story or the significance of it today. And so, you know, really thinking about this idea that stories become embodied once they're sort of embedded in objects, that they become much more tangible and much more understandable when we can kind of use the idea of the object as a way to explore them. And to bring in these multiple ways of participation, so collecting objects in person but also online, thinking about the different kinds of objects that can tell stories, so personal objects and public objects, doing research on very little documented kind of work, so very personal objects, like the Rosie Wiener portrait, collected from her great niece. So this is a photograph of something that sits on her mantelpiece, or her bookshelf actually, and so that becomes part of this archive, and this is what it looks like in the open archive itself. Or objects like a newsletter from the 1982 Chinatown garment workers strike, so having nothing to do, so I should say Rosie Wiener was a victim of the Triangle Fire. You know, then we jump forward to 1982, what does that have to do with 1911, right? It has something to do with the larger questions that are at stake then and that are at stake now, and certainly also were the local that actually came out of the Triangle Fire as well. So this is sort of gathering these objects in person, photographing them, and then also letting them live online, and live online in their sort of contradictory ways together. The project that's come out of this work this year is the Open Museum, and you guys can pick up these booklets, they're all back there, they look like this, is a way of taking these objects offline and bringing them back into the tangible world, and to think about how can we insert them back into people's experience. So rather than you having to go to the online archive, how can you kind of find these things around the city itself? So we borrowed objects back from people, or we made replicas. And this is what these things look like, and they're right now all around the city in 6 different sites. So 5 of which there are pictures of here. So Tenement Museum, you can go and find these little orange boxes and sort of go find the narratives and the histories that people have connected to the physical objects in the online archive. You can find them here, but you can actually see the physical objects. So this is at the Murphy Institute at CUNY. This is at Workers United, FIT. So also these are really important sites that tell you something not only about New York's history, or because they happen to be kind of nice places to go and see things, or because they happen to be open to the public, but they are also sites that talk about these larger questions that are embedded in the Triangle Fire itself, in a contemporary context, right? So Museum of Chinese America has an image of that newsletter, right? So you can think about the ways in which we're sort of bringing these objects out into the world, and one of the things that we've been really interested in is the ways in which sort of situating objects in the world can actually then lead to further conversation around sort of using the objects themselves. And so you can find them across the city. And really one of the things that I just want to kind of highlight is this idea of this sort of public project as making space for dialogue, right? So that, and acting as a kind of bridge, so between city sites and institutions that are in and of themselves really significant, but also between aspects of public memory, public practice, public history, so to use both these two projects as ways of making connections between those, and in that connection, that the point of it is to get people to talk around these sites and to make spaces for that kind of talk to happen. So thinking about these are very different kinds of talk and different kinds of dialogic practice, but I see a lot of connections between them, and I think particularly in their basis around kind of nuanced richness of personal histories as being the basis for these sorts of projects. And the fact that there is something that you can take away from both projects and use those things to explore the city and see the city itself in a different way, to sort of insert yourself in a new way into those dialogues as well. So thank you very much, and please feel free to pick up some of these things at the back and keep going through.
Moment for technological change. Seconds more and we'll be there. Hi, and thanks especially to the students who did the pre-2 hours and now doing the long haul run. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to blaze through an overview of a lot of work that I've made, because mostly what I'd like to talk about is sort of bigger issues than any specific project. And kind of what I'd like to start with is, I've sort of reached the point where I feel very strongly that I like to try to create projects that for people, just by participating in them, they are empowered and have that experience, rather than me telling them they should be empowered, which I don't think is particularly effective. But it's taken me many, many projects to sort of evolve and experiment with that, and things that worked and things that have not worked so very well. So I'm just going to go through a bunch of those projects very quickly. My background is actually in film production. My father and my father's side of the family has been in theater for a bazillion years, and my stepfather is an 8x10 view camera photographer. So I thought I was going to rebel by going into film, and only many years later did I realize it was like the complete marriage of those two. So I started out by making films, and by sort of a mixture of working with people and putting my vision on it. So I'm going to show you just very quickly, because this relates to something we were talking about earlier. We were asked about mistakes and things that did not go well, and I had done a project which went horribly wrong, and not horribly, but not so great. And so I made this film in response to that. It's just 3 minutes, and I hope everything works technically, and if not, we'll improvise. So.
spirit of God. We're mothers of courage and fathers of time. We're daughters of dust and sons of great nations. We're sisters of mercy and brothers of love. We're lovers of light and builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We're makers of peace and wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of the ancestors. We are the spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are one.
So what I learned from this project was mostly, what was surprising to me was that when I started sending it out to festivals, I started getting an inordinate number of questions about was Bruce Jackson actually disabled or not? And it was really shocking to me that people would ask that, because it was so clear to me that yes, he has cerebral palsy and he's disabled, and I didn't really know where that was coming from. And then I had a great conversation with Dr. Ise Barnwell of Sweet Honey in the Rock, who do the song, and I mentioned it to her, and she was like, Ruth, you have to understand, people have compartments in their brain, and they have one compartment for grace and beauty and another compartment for disability, and they just cannot conceive that they would be matched together. And that was a real eye-opener to me about how narrow the portrayal of our lives that we see in our day-to-day lives. And it's so easy to just step out of that. If you tell anything truthful about yourself, you pretty much fall out of what is in the accepted dialogue. So that was a really great clue for me. And I went on to start making films where I would do a lot of research and then write the script, and then I would go find the population that was depicted in my work, and I would not show them the script, but I would tell them the story of the film, and then we would workshop for many, many weeks on the themes and ideas, when we would do improvisations and theater games and just talking about the issues, and I would videotape it. And then I would take their language and put it back into the structure of the script I had already created. And then we would go and shoot these films, and it was a very traditional 35mm shoot. So they were thrown out of that whole comfortable womb of the workshop process for the shoot. And I was in the midst of doing that, and I started to notice some problems for myself, which was that I was creating these films because I wanted to create a transformative experience for the audience. And when I would go to screenings, I always would sit at the front, by the side, and I would turn and I'd watch the audience, because I'd seen the movie, I didn't care. And I would look at different people to see how they were responding in different moments. And then you sort of realize, like, when you've made a film, you're stuck. Like, it's always going to be the same film. You can't change, you can't do anything. And at the same time, in a sense, the audience is stuck, because you're saying you want to transform them, but at the same time, you're asking them to sit silently and still in the dark, and to be polite and good in all those very constricting ways. And I began to think about ways that we could maybe break out of that model. But in the midst of that, 9/11 happened, and I began volunteering down at Here is New York, a Democracy of Photographs, which opened just days later on Prince Street in Soho. And what they did is they would take, people could bring in photographs that related to 9/11, and we would scan them and print them and then hang them on the wall. And there was hundreds of photographs shown. And it became like a makeshift memorial, and also, as time progressed, a safe place for people to engage with their feelings about 9/11. So if you wanted to think about 9/11 or be around other people who were thinking about it, you could come to this place. And in fact, there was lines around the block for people who needed that safe space in the time after that. And I started there as a volunteer photo editor in early October, and what that meant is I would sit at a table and people would come to me, and sometimes they would just like dump like hundreds of photographs, and we would sort through them to find the few that would be contributed. And I noticed that there was really interesting things happening in the stories people were telling. One is that, especially in the early days, the stories were extremely shattered and often did not make a logical sense at that point. And also that people would come back and they would say literally identical things because they wanted me to say identical things in response, so that then they could go back and correct their story as they were starting to piece things together. And I also noticed that some people were getting silenced, and that was particularly clear with the firefighters. At first they had been very open and talking to people, and then my interpretation is that a lot of them had the experience of, they were supposed to be the heroes, so they would talk to some whatever interviewer about their experience, and then that interview would be shown, but it would be edited. And the edited version is that they are a hero and they did some heroic, wonderful thing on 9/11. But their actual experience of it was often much more sad, and that community is very collaborative, and you are not supposed to put yourself first before others. And so that interview would be shown in this model of heroism, and then their buddies are like, what the heck are you doing, like saying this stuff? And they're like, well, I didn't say it that way. And they're like, but we saw it on TV and you did. And so they were, and so then they just shut up because they didn't want to share their stories. So I was thinking about stories being the first way that we can own our own experience of these kinds of events. And so I decided to create this project, Voices of 9/11, and we built a booth. I used as a model the old photo booths where you get the strips when you sit there and you do your poses and you get things, because I thought that was something people would feel comfortable with. And one thing I'll say about this project is that I think a number of people since then have asked me how I did this project technically, and I'm always happy to share and tell everyone exactly how I did it, but then I always say the technology did not make the project. It was the environment we created around it that made it successful. And then they copy the technology and they don't do the environment, and then their projects don't work. So pay attention. If you want to make a video booth, I think there was some really important things about how we did this project. The first is, in the first versions of the video booth, they were in the Here's New York gallery, so people were already there in that space that created a particular environment. Excuse me. They also had to make an appointment to speak in the booth. So they had already thought through, to some degree or another, what they were going to say. Later, once we got to the Pentagon, for example, we were essentially in a mall in the Pentagon. But it was okay, because by then we had enough experience to carry people through. But we had a very specific process for people who came to speak in the booth. That was one of the first things we did, because you had to fill out a release form, was the person who brought you through signing the release and going through the process was instructed to acknowledge wherever the speaker was coming from. So if they lost somebody, you would acknowledge that they had lost somebody. If they were a survivor, you would say that you were so sorry that they had this experience and you're so grateful for them to participate in this. Because a lot of people, when you've experienced trauma, you need to tell the story so many times to kind of push it and shove it into a shape that you can live with. And very often, it's many more times than the people in your life can actually hear that story. And so so you start to constrict yourself, and we wanted to create a space where people could open themselves again to whatever they needed to express about this story. So I'm just going to show you the booth for now. This is the booth set up in the Pentagon. At a certain point we had, when people came out of the booth, we would give them a Sharpie and they could write something on the outside of the booth. So it's like not a pretty object. we did the whole Voices project for the recordings for probably like $50,000 or $60,000. We recorded about 550 testimonies. Here in New York City, we went to Shanksville, Pennsylvania. We were in the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. for the 1-year anniversary. And then we were inside the Pentagon for 3 weeks. And my experience was that people were very specific in what they wanted to share. Mostly they wanted to share things that you could not know unless you had experienced something like this. So I'm going to show a very, very, very short clip from one of the speakers from the booth.
That I realized that there were people jumping from the building, there were people falling, and there were people jumping, and every single one of them was different. This wasn't just something going out the building, or every single individual. It was different with every single individual. The language of the fall, the language of the body, it expressed something different. Some were helpless, and some were terrified, and some were so defiant, like, if my life's ending, then I'm ending it, defiant. And but every one of them was who they were, and I couldn't film anymore after that, so I turned the camera off.
So once that project was created, I feel like it's not that I only do projects about people dying and going out of buildings, but I've been long obsessed with the Triangle Fire. I grew up in New York City, and I think you grow up with this story here. And I always wanted to make something about it, but I could not think of a way to do it. And every couple of years I would come back to it, and I thought I should make a movie, and every idea I had was like incredibly schmaltzy and stupid and just like, ugh. And so I would have to release it, and then a couple years later I'd try again, and still nothing. And then, fortunately, in 2004, David Vondrelli's wonderful book, Triangle, the Fire That Changed America, came out. And in the back he listed the names and the ages and the addresses of the victims of the fire. And I just felt in my heart something so strong when I read that list. And also I had a film, this is the real story, I had a film that was about to open at a big festival, and I was very nervous, so I wanted to distract myself. So I emailed about 30 friends of mine and just said, hey, I have this crazy idea. How about if on the anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, we all go out to the victims' homes and we write in chalk their names, their ages, that they lived at this address, and they died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And even that first year, those emails just got dispersed, many, many steps removed. And now, and I didn't think of it anything beyond this first initial project, and now this past year was the 9th year of the project, and people are much more creative than I ever was. They do drawings, they do rituals. Now many people who live in the buildings like to chalk the person who lived in their building. Family members chalk their family members. The Stanton Street Shoal likes to pick a victim and then do a lot of research, and then they made it like a community event on Clinton Street this year. So it's taken on a life of its own, and I think in part it's because I don't control it. We never have a meeting. I've never met many of the chalkers. They've never met many of each other. I have like, somebody will say, oh, I want to chalk this person. I always chalk this person who lived in my building, and if you want, I'll do the person who lived across the street, because we always imagine they walked to work together, and I'm like, you can't do the person across the street because the person in that building likes to chalk their person. So it's been an ongoing, and I feel like there's been an organic development of the project where people have really taken possession of certain names that they feel very. This year somebody who lived in the building was going to be out of town, so they got somebody else in their building to cover for them, and these kinds of things are happening now. And next year will be the 10th year, so I think I'm going to finally make something so we can all meet each other just once. But I don't even know exactly what that's going to be. And so through doing this, I became very aware of the diversity of communities that feel very personally passionate about the Triangle Fire. And one of the things that I think I was thinking about out of the 9/11 project was how can we get along with what I call hard tolerance. So not the easy tolerance of, oh, we should all get along and everything should be fine, but what about when you hit those walls, what actually you don't like that other person, or you don't think things should be done that way? Like, what do we do in those situations? And the wonderful thing about Triangle is so many people come to the story and feel very personally passionate about it, but from completely different points of view. So people from the labor movement feel very strongly about it. New Yorkers feel strong about it. People who live in the East Village and Lower East Side feel strongly. Women feel strongly about it. The Jewish community feels strongly. The Italian American community, the fire and safety community, and they all have a personal investment in it. So I decided to start the. I knew that the centennial was coming up in 2011, and I wanted to create a way for all these people to work together, even if they had very different beliefs and agendas, in a way that we could create the centennial together. And really, we winged it at the beginning. We started in 2008. I just called a meeting with some people who I thought might be passionate about the Triangle. And it was, I would say, like 1.5, 2 years of a very small number of people, some of whom are in this room tonight, who would get together, like 5 of us, and we'd all kind of stare at each other and go, we think this is going to work, but we don't even really know if this is going to work. And I think 2 things became very clear to me that were vital to make this successful. One was that everybody had to be welcome. There had to no restrictions, no curation. If you were passionate about Triangle, you were in with us, and that was it. And the second was that decision-making power was given to the people who did the work. So there was never like an administrative overview. It started with me being a benign dictator until it reached the point where people were tired of me being a benign dictator, and then we formed an organizational structure, but very far into the project. And I think that's a lot of the time, it was really hard to get support for the project at first, because I honestly didn't know what we were creating, and it was only way into it that I realized, like, people kept saying, well, what event are you doing, or what law do you want passed? And it took me a long time to realize that what we were creating actually was a platform for people to do their own best work, because that's actually ultimately the most empowering thing. So by the end of by the centennial, we had over 250 individuals and organizations across the country participating in doing events in their local communities for the centennial. And all we did was keep creating in response to things that came up. So I started to notice on our Facebook page, people were starting to put these extraordinary documents and pictures. And then I sort of had a little bit of a lame idea, oh, we should have a timeline or something so we can actually, Facebook is not forever, so we can make this forever and save these things. And fortunately, I was put in touch with Gabrielle and Koshik of Buscada and said something a little dense about timeline guys, something like that, and boom, their brilliance was the open archive. And I think that's a perfect example how if you actually give up control, you get something much better than you could ever do on your own. We started getting emails about resources, people having resources, knowing about young adult novels or teaching plans. And Andy here started making a web page of all of those things so that then we could just send people to where they could find stuff. Then we wanted to work more closely with the union that organizes the commemoration every year. And it was suggested that we maybe do something with the 2009 Labor Day parade. And Andy and Joel here said, well, let's go to the Central Labor Council, who I didn't know who they were. And we went there and we created 146 shirtwaists that float on bamboo poles, one for each victim of the fire, and marched in the Labor Day parade. And we were definitely the coolest thing in the Labor Day parade.
With
and
a fire engine.
What?
With a fire
and
engine.
we had a fire engine for people who could not walk the walk. And then when the centennial was coming, we realized there was people who were not in New York who really wanted to participate. So we created the Bells Project, where people could email or put a comment on the website, and say that they were going to ring a bell at 4:45, the exact time the first alarm was set for the triangle fire. And we created a map, and if you said you were going to ring a bell for your great Aunt Mary, who was a garment worker, and you were going to do it in Chicago, Illinois, we put a pin on the map for Chicago, Illinois, and if you clicked on the pin, it would say that you were doing it for your great Aunt Mary. And we got like a couple of hundred people participating across the country in that, and which led to, I'm going to just show a little bit from the centennial.
Sisters, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Edgar Romney from Workers United, and thank you so much for being here today. 100 years ago, on this very day, there was a fire where 146 young men and women lost their lives because the doors were locked and they couldn't get out. Many of them died in the fire escapes. Many of them had to jump out the window. And it is our obligation and responsibility to make sure we never forget what happened to those 146 workers.
Representing the descendants of the triangle victims.
What a fantastic crowd. You give testimony and new meaning to Francis Perkins' words. They did not die in vain, and we will never forget them. Let this Triangle Fire Centennial be a call to all of us to rededicate our energies, raise our voices, and become more active in the pursuit of justice for all working people. We stand with you from Wisconsin to Bangladesh in solidarity. Thank you.
So I think I'm going to stop there so we have time for questions and answers. Thank you for having me.
You must be tired.